Bienvenue à la...
Welcome, then, to this afternoon session of our committee. Today we are the 7th of July and we have Mr. Kingsley with us. Mr. Kingsley, welcome to you. If we could have a quiet in the room, please, that would be super. Welcome, Mr. Kingsley. Thank you for having made yourself available to the committee to meet with us this afternoon. In July, here we are together to talk about electoral reform.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie sincèrement.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to you and to the members of the committee for providing me with the opportunity to appear before you today as you are starting on this extremely essential work for the Canadian public.
Demanding your work is as an MP. It's something for which I've always had the most profound respect. I know the sacrifices that you make. It's a pleasure as well, I must say. There's a number of you whom I've met, but I want to mention Mr. Christopher and Mr. Reid, Christopherson, sorry, and Mr. Reid. We did a lot of work together at the other committee, Procedure and House Affairs. And so that is the answer to when shall we three meet again. It's I heard Mr. Kenny speak yesterday of the strength of Canada, of the fundamental values of Canadians, of the strength of our institutions, and that includes a functioning parliament with a loyal opposition, well-funded, an independent judiciary as incorporated in our Supreme Court and the other court systems, the Auditor General, the Chief Electoral Officer, to be blunt, freedom of the press, political parties. I attribute importance to that. That's part of the right of assembly and the right of free speech. Civil society is also a necessary adjunct to our Canadian values. The right for us to organize ourselves as we wish in accordance with legal objectives. I also heard President Obama say that the world needs more Canada. We rank at the highest level because of the quality of our democracy, along with a very small handful of other countries. I agree with both those speakers, by the way, both Mr. Kenny and President Obama. Because of our international reputation and the quality of our electoral processes, Elections Canada visited or received visitors, and we visited when we were invited, not otherwise, by myriad delegations from around the world. I can't remember if it was 80 or 100. We met with different countries who came to us or invited us because of the quality of our democracy and, at the same time, the quality of our electoral processes. And yet a number of questions are being raised in our society today about the role, the appointment of senators, the functioning of parliamentary committees, the authority of the Prime Minister, and our electoral system. And the very strength of our democracy lies in our very ability to question its functioning and to seek ways to improve it, always. This is what is at the heart of our electoral system, or at the heart of our democracy, the quality of it. And that brings me to why we are here. We've given ourselves, we claim, a system of representative democracy, because we've not yet found the way to govern ourselves by obtaining the participation of the electorate on every societal question, every societal decision. We haven't found a way yet to have direct democracy, as opposed to representative democracy. Since Confederation, the two main parties have served us well and have been well served by our first-past-the-post system of representation. Third parties, and I call them, it's not third in the sense of the Elections Act, it's other parties, have existed, were permitted right from the start. There was never an interdiction to have third parties. And we could accept the results of elections because those parties were not garnering a lot of electoral support. So we could say to ourselves, well, you know, this party got 52% of the votes, 60% of the seats, not an issue, they got 52% of the votes. However, for some time now, those parties, third parties, have been having much more success. We ineffectively have become the victims of our own success in allowing different ways of expressing themselves beyond what I've called the two main parties historically. And the awareness of Canadians, and I'm talking about many civil organizations such as Fair Vote Canada, others with whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, the awareness of Canadians of what I put in quotation marks here, distortions of the results compared to the express will of Canadians has been growing. This has been growing over time. Now, the minister, academia, the media have all given examples. I don't intend to reiterate them. I don't want to waste the committee's time. They were here yesterday. Fundamentally, the issue of 40% of the votes getting you 60% of the seats has begun to raise questions amongst Canadians. The other distortion lies in the fact that it takes 700,000 votes to get one seat under our system. And it takes 30,000 votes, if you're in a governing party, to be elected. One member, 30,000 votes. One member, 700,000 votes. This is the type of disproportion which is beginning to raise questions. And we owe people, because there are more and more of them, we owe them an explanation, and we owe them the opportunity to review what it is that we could do that's different. Is there something that we could do that is better? There are other tried systems of representation, each with its strengths, its weaknesses. And by the way, some of the strengths are viewed as weaknesses by some and vice versa. So there's not even going to be agreement on what is the strength of a system, but there will be, and it can be, general agreement about general strengths. And I would recommend to the committee that each one must be weighed, and 3 or 4 main ones, advantages and disadvantages of the different systems that will be presented to you, should be focused on. If you try to focus on the 15th factor, you will find yourself spending a lot of time at this for what will be disproportionately useless work. Now, a number of criteria or factors have been put forward for enlightenment of Canadians, and the minister said you cannot broaden this. And I would like to submit several for your consideration. The first one is what I would call the relative simplicity of the system or the ballot that would replace if we replace the present system. By the way, nothing will be viewed as simple as the present system because we've been at it for 149 years. I don't care what you propose. It cannot be as simple because we've been doing it for 149 years. This is part of the woof and fabric. This is part of the DNA of being Canadian, being born Canadian. The real point is that the elector must understand the choice that he or she is making. How does my vote translate into our system of representation? Canadians must understand that. And at the same time, they must understand how does that translate into the establishment of a government and a functioning parliament. This is what is at the heart of it. The second one is the rapport, the link between the elector and the elected, both for the representation of the elector, collectively and individually, and the accountability of the elected representatives. These are two factors that, in my view, exist together and are related to that link between the elector and the elected. Canadians are well accustomed to that rapport, to that link, and it's something that has to be weighed very carefully if there's going to be any change. And the third factor that I wanted to bring forward is the tendency or the need to reinforce or to favor coast-to-coast-to-coast representation within political parties. And I'm talking about national parties that would be of broad orientation, would have representation across the country. In other words, with representation in caucus from across the land, and not have blocks of the country missing or significantly underrepresented. I think that is essential for caucus. I'm not sure that we've always obtained that. We may not even have it today. And of course, the same applies to cabinet, but I put more emphasis on the caucus, because I know what happens at caucus This is vital to our system of representative government. A corollary to that would be, try to avoid intra-party competition between candidates at election time. I mean, if you have candidates from the same party vying for the same seat, and they're in competition with one another, I think that affects party unity, and that's something that should be weighed very carefully. The fourth factor was the ability to obtain parity between women and men. I heard all your conversations, by the way, both yesterday and today. I was glued to my television set. I mean, what can I say? I couldn't stay away. You're so fascinating. It is important. The fifth one is that Canadian reality must be reflected in the system of representation. And by that I mean we simply have to take into account that there's 36 million of us. We're the second largest country in the world in terms of geographical expanse. We're sparsely populated in many of those areas, as a matter of fact, the brunt of the country, and yet we're significantly urbanized for the population that we've got. Ingenuity, compromise will be required. In other words, we may have to borrow from one system for one part and another system for another part. There's nothing that prevents us from considering this. Canadians must be able to see themselves in the representatives and in the system by which they choose them. This is what I mean by must reflect Canadian reality. This is what we're aiming for. That's why I'm talking about parity between men and women. The corollary to the constitutional right to vote is effective representation. That is the corollary to the right to vote. It's all right to have the right to vote, Section 3 of the Charter. But it has to mean something. It has to be effective representation. And the Supreme Court has used that expression. Our right to effective representation. A few words about compulsory voting. Compulsory voting is, first of all, a misnomer, or at least it should be made a misnomer. No system should be contemplated whereby electors must choose only among candidates. That is unthinkable. There needs to be the right to have a choice in the marking of the ballot. I do not wish to vote should be one of the choices. Okay? And therefore, you no longer have compulsory voting. You have compulsory attendance at the polls. And you have the free choice. You don't like any of them. You don't even have to say, I don't like any of them. You're not aware of the issues. You don't have to be aware of the issues. Just say, I do not wish to vote, or words to that effect. Now, and I can hear the arguments, because this is a value-laden consideration. Some people will consider it as opposing a fundamental human right not to participate. And one can only wonder, what would be the debate that would be taking place in Australia if compulsory attendance at the polls was being debated over there and they wanted to go to the system we have? I can only assume the debate would center on the civil obligation to fulfill one's civic duty. And I can hear them discussing around, why do we want to leave our system? Right now, our system citizens have an obligation to let us know what they think, and this is all part of it. Is not, the point I'm trying to make is, in Canada and in Australia, it is not a fundamental value of our system. It is something where we have to answer the question, what is it that best fits the temper of Canadians, and what minimal level of electoral participation gives legitimacy to our elected representatives and to our government? Legitimacy is tied to participation. It is not tied to legality. Legality is, of course, subsumed. It is assumed. If you don't have legality, you don't have legitimacy. But you can have legality, you can have the best processes. What happens? At what stage do we say, we flipped this government? There's doubt about its legitimacy, participation. What else can we do about participation? Online voting, it's coming fast. That light at the end of the tunnel is a train. The manner and the speed of its implementation are what is critical. The analogy with online purchasing and banking, and I heard the arguments this morning, is flawed. The argument is flawed, and Marc Mérand answered that question. And banks, other institutions hedge the risk, and they remove the risk from at least most of the time, from the person, from the individual. A margin of error is acceptable against which they successfully hedge. Okay? What margin of error is acceptable to us with the electoral system? Online voting should be considered initially, and I repeat what Mark said this morning, for electors with mobility difficulties, for Canadians, and I will add one, Canadians who are not in their riding, because we have at least that. Maybe one day we'll have voting in the riding as opposed to each poll, tied to a poll. Maybe we'll have that. That should be coming. Let's see what Mark has to say about that. But from one end of the country to the other, you still need, if you're not in your riding, you should still be able to vote. And this would be one way of doing it. And Canadians abroad where there's still a legal case before the courts as to whether or not this applies universally to Canadians or those who've been gone for less than 5 years. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, the moment we start to introduce it, what are going to be the ID requirements? When I want to register, what do I have to give? My driver's license? My fingerprints? Mexico has fingerprints, all 10. A photograph of my iris, left eye probably, or whatever. And then how do I check that when people are voting? What do I have at the center? So the issue, that's one issue about security of voting. What's required at the beginning? And the other one is, what is the security that is attached to the transmittal of the results? The transmittal of the vote and then the transmittal of the results. And here I'm going to suggest that we will have to consider doubling systems and having separate systems whereby we control, and I may be completely wrong, there may be a new technology that'll be invented, but at this stage I'm thinking one way of introducing it would be that. And eventually we will see, because we're talking about the fact that people of a certain age have less of a tendency to live at the end of their gizmos. Well, we have several generations, which is living at the end of this thing now, and they're going to be the old people one of these days, and they're going to say, how come I can't vote on this? This is my only way to relate. So those were comments that I wanted to make. Again,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much.
Merci.
We can do, if members don't mind going over past 4 o'clock by a couple of minutes, we can do two rounds of 5 minutes, very tight 5 minutes each MP, or is everyone good with that? But it's going to be a tight 5 minutes, and the 5 minutes covers the question and the answer. So we'll get going with Mr. De Courcy.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here with us this afternoon. You have obviously dedicated yourself to this for a long time. You've worked for Canada, for Canadians, and for our democratic institutions. As I said earlier, it's certainly, we've heard you present on the Hill before. I was a student at the time, and I've heard you talking about different Canadian aspects of the institutions.
Length about the importance of civic engagement, about the importance of casting a ballot, and it's ever since impressed upon me the fundamental role that Elections Canada and the Chief Electoral Officer has to reach out and sensitize Canadians and educate Canadians about the importance of their electoral system. I wonder if you can speak maybe a little bit about the role that you saw in your time as Chief Electoral Officer in reaching out to Canadians, the current mandate of Elections Canada, maybe how that incapacitates some of those opportunities, and what opportunities could be available with a more robust mandate for Elections Canada.
Well, first, thank you very much for reminding me of those wonderful times that I had with the Forum for Young Canadians. I enjoyed each one of those opportunities, and well, it's good to be reminded. Second of all, with respect to the present mandate, Mr. Mirand explained this morning just what it is that he can do, and so I won't elaborate on that. You know how that came about. That's only 2 years old. The curtailment of the role of Elections Canada, the Chief Electoral Officer, in reaching out to the actual electorate. What Elections Canada did when I was Chief Electoral Officer is we, in a sense, perpetuated but built upon what my predecessor had done when he was advertising about the right to vote and how to go about it, and participating in forums where he could effectively propagate the importance of this. What is important for young people is to understand not how we do it, that's essential. They have to understand what democracy is about, why this is so important to them, their future, and that's something that is missing in a lot of cases. And if we succeeded in translating that to them, we would succeed a lot. But we also targeted, and I think it was 1997, Parliament actually said and put it in the statute, Chief Electoral Officer may particularly reach out to groups that are significantly disadvantaged, blah, 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 about this. And that's when we embarked upon particular missions with minority groups, did more intensive things. The people who were disadvantaged because of inability to reach to the polls, people with disabilities, what we consider disabilities, and Aboriginal Canadians. And with respect to these groups, what we did with each one of them is meet with them and find out, how do we reach out to your membership? We didn't just try to reach out directly. And what we found to be particularly useful, by the way, when we reached out to the Aboriginal groups, was to get to the Aboriginal groups and have them transmit the message. And this occurred particularly, I think it was the 2004 election, when we got the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, as well as other leaders, to mount campaigns with Elections Canada and to speak to the people. And so this is what we set out to do. And as I understand it now, this is no longer possible under the present mandate.
We have about a minute.
Well, I ask, and thank you for the answer, because you speak about any other system not being as simple as the one we currently have for Canadians to understand. So I think it's being impressed upon us the need to have a robust education and outreach strategy and sensitization strategy for Canadians. I hope someone else will pick up on this when their time comes. But you mentioned the link between electors and the elected. I wonder, in the brief time you have, if you can start to expand on what you mean by that.
Yeah. Well, what I mean is the Canadian reality now. We vote for one person amongst a group. There's a linkage that exists. You know, if you don't know who your MP is, you can know. If you need to be represented in the bureaucracy for some reason, you can reach your MP. That's an important value. And you can hold that person accountable at the next ballot.
We have to go to Mr. Reid now.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here. You're right, we go back a long way. I don't want other members of the committee to read too much into this, but I actually have known you longer than I've known my wife. And I've always, I must say, I've always respected the depth that you brought to the role when you were Chief Electoral Officer, and also the way you've contributed to the national debate on various aspects of democracy since that time. I wanted to start by asking you about a quotation, a quote you made in an interview on June the 5th. It was regarding the Referendum Act. I'll start by quoting the Referendum Act, and then I'll come back to your quote. The Referendum Act says, in Section 3, subsection 1, where the Governor in Council considers that it is in the public interest to obtain by means of a referendum the opinion of electors on any question relating to the Constitution of Canada, the Governor and Council may, by proclamation, direct that the opinion of electors be obtained by putting the question to the electors of Canada in a referendum. That's the end of that quote. On June the 5th, on CTV's program, The West Block, you made comments that I think have been misinterpreted in some of the media. What you said, and I am quoting again here, is legislation will have to be significantly changed in order for there to be a referendum on electoral reform. And the number one consideration, you can only hold a federal referendum in Canada on a constitutional matter. changing the electoral system is not a constitutional matter, end quote. And then finally, just as a representative example, I see coverage that came out of like this. Many people were, I'm quoting again from a story, many people were left to wonder if the opposition Conservatives failed to actually read the rule book before calling loudly for a national vote on electoral reform, end quote, based upon their reading of your comments. But I think that writer and some others misinterpreted what you were saying. You can correct me here, but I think what you were saying was simply that in order to have a referendum on a non-constitutional matter like electoral reform, you would have to amend the Referendum Act and allow other questions to be placed, non-constitutional questions to be placed. Am I right in my interpretation?
Yeah. Well, sir, you're absolutely right, and that is exactly what I meant. And I wanted to thank you for the question you raised yesterday, which made it very clear that I was speaking in a nonpartisan manner when I said this. I do not care what political parties say or do as individual political parties in any respect. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that.
And the fact that some
yes.
writers interpreted that to mean that some people did not do their work is not fair. It's as simple as that.
I must say, I don't think any reasonable person could have interpreted you as taking a partisan position at all. But it did look, if you read just the coverage, not your comments, as if you were saying, you can't get there from here, whereas I think you were actually saying you have to do the following thing to get there from here.
Well, the very fact that you're raising the question and raised it is an indication that I did perform a public service effectively.
That is true. I wanted to ask this other question, and I have a feeling this will take more time than we have, so I'll pose the question now. If you can't answer it now, then I'll just essentially remind you of it when I get my second round. You were the Chief Electoral Officer when the last referendum took place in 1992. And I just want to go through some facts that are relevant here. The Referendum Act received royal assent on June the 23rd, 1992. A referendum was held on October the 26th, 1992, which would be 4 months and 3 days later. And the actual question was one that was crafted at the tail end of August. Specifically, the question in that referendum was, do you agree that the Constitution of Canada should be renewed on the basis of the agreement reached on August the 28th, 1992? So I look at that and I see a much more compressed timeline than we've contemplated, a 4-month timeline. And I wanted to ask how you made that happen and whether such a feat could be replicated today. And the reason I ask this is that Mr. Meron has indicated a 6-month referendum. It would require 6 months to organize and carry out a referendum. So is it possible to go below that, or were there circumstances in those days that made it different and made it possible to have a more compressed timeline in order to hold a referendum?
Would you like Mr. Kingsley to answer that when it comes around again? Because we're up, our time is up. Thank you. Mr. Christofferson. And that'll be very interesting. That'll be a very interesting answer. We're looking forward to hearing it. Mr.
Are you setting me up?
No, not at all. No.
Take a minute of my time and give an answer to that
there you
question,
go.
Mr. Kingsley. There you are, Chair. You got what you wanted. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Well, I heard Mr. Meron talk this morning about the 6 months minimum that he would require, and I generally would agree with that. One must remember that the experience of the 1992 referendum is easy to trace. There's a lot of documentation at Elections Canada, in the media, elsewhere, and so there are a lot of the provisions of the statute that could be easily replicated. There's a lot that would have to be changed, as I said. One of them would be the constitutional one, if it's not a constitutional question, as well as references to the Canada Elections Act. There's only 40 sections to the Referendum Act, and when you hold an election, there's 300, 400, I don't remember how many. So there were references. They need to be refreshed. The reason we were able to succeed was because it was such a high political imperative at the time. Initially, the government did not want a referendum, at least most of the members of the government, the Prime Minister, others. That changed when the provinces started to say, well, we have to hold a referendum, and people started to get concerned, well, what's the provincial question going to be? Is it going to be the same? So by holding a federal referendum, the question was the same. And so, but in terms of ability to carry it out, it was because I was able to take the Elections Act, the organization of Elections Canada, and just make it work for the referendum. We went as if it were an election. with the same returning officers and the same hiring patterns. Everything was just replicated, and that simplified matters within a reasonable 6-month period.
And you owe me too. You owe me too. All right. For what time I have left, Chair, if I can squeeze in a question. First of all, I want to, everything I said about Mr. Mayrand, I apply to you, sir, and thank you for your contribution. You still continue to provide guidance for us, and thank you for that. In addition to being our Chief Electoral Officer from 90 to 07, you were also the President and Chief Executive Officer of International Foundation for Electoral Systems in a Washington-based NGO. One of the beauties of having you here is that you have all the informed knowledge that Mr. Mayrand has, but you also have the ability to give opinions, which is more difficult for him while he's in office. The whole notion, if I can just ask you base level, the whole notion of a 39% vote, because the current government actually got less popular vote than the previous government. By a small amount, but smaller nonetheless. The idea that 39% of the vote gets you 100% of the power is a problem for some of us. Even in my own riding, for instance, the government talks about moving to a majority. They talk about that as a preference, an alternate vote. But even this term, I got 47. But last election, I got 57. Fair enough. That's a nice, clear majority. But the 43% that didn't vote for me got no voice. It had no effect. I just walked away with everything, as did everyone who won on a first-past-the-post. So can you just give us sort of a civics lesson for Canadians as to why, with your international experience, it makes sense that we would move from our comfort position, our comfort zone of first-past-the-post, into something that more accurately reflects the will of the people?
Well, so that international experience demonstrated, because you raised it, I can't think of a country that went with a first-past-the-post system when they were installing a democracy. Because of known difficulties. Now, there may have been one. I can't say that there was none, but you're getting the gist here. And that was the reason why I indicated why I think we need to look at this. Canadians have to come to an agreement. This is how we do it. And if we maintain the present system, the people will simply have to lump it.
Sorry? Do you want to expand? So what you're saying is basically if we don't make a change, Canadians are going to be left with a system that doesn't as accurately, am I understanding?
The very fact that you're looking at it, that Parliament is looking at this in such great detail, okay, and you're focusing on this, if you do not come out with a new system, then the people who are complaining about the old system, or about the system that's in place now, they will simply have to understand that is the way that the matter has been settled. This is part of the compromises that Canada is willing to make.
Right.
Do I agree with that? Do I not agree with that? That is another issue.
Right.
I wish to see a fair process undertaken here, which is why I'm here.
You have a preferred model that you've talked about. Can you expand on that for us a little here?
Well, what it was, and I know
very briefly, please, because we have Mr. Thériault who's waiting to ask a question.
Okay, may I come back to that later, sir?
Well, let's see what the next person who has the floor does.
I told you they'd be tight 5-minute rounds. Monsieur Thériault?
Good afternoon. I very much appreciate your testimony. In the spirit of the Figueroa decision handed down by the Supreme Court, do you not believe that we must, whilst redefining our voting system that allows plurality and representation, there should also be state funding, more equitable state funding? Well, there was previously a more equitable state funding system, the one through which a $2 subsidy per vote for a party was handed out for each vote annually on a quarterly basis. I think this went part of the way and was a considerable improvement, and I think that we should come back to this system. Perhaps not at $2, Initially, our data easily justified $1.50 per vote. Today, it might be $2, but I would happily accept $1.50 per vote. This would be a fairer way of doing things. It's not the perfect way of doing things. It is impossible to achieve a perfectly fair election system. There will always be people who will be favoured and those who will be at a disadvantage. We are merely trying to make them we're trying to minimise them as much as possible and make them reasonable for Canadians. It allowed small parties to not lose their vote during an election because by receiving this funding they managed to make themselves heard between election campaigns and so that they can take part in our electoral process, and that's what the Figueroa decision stated. In a parliament, we do not necessarily have to have a Green candidate, and I apologise to Ms May, but the Green Party and other such parties should have the same means, the same fair means to make themselves heard in our democratic debate, which here we call an election. You're clearly tending towards a mixed system. You're saying that the relation between various MPs and voters is important. I understand there would be a majority vote system, but what would the other option be? Where would I bring in the proportionality into the results? Well, that refers to the questions that I've already been asked. It's a suggestion that I've made. I asked the media to listen up. It's not a proposal I made because I don't have the time to elaborate. The proposal I made, the suggestion rather I made, is as follows. Given that Canada is such a vast country, for remote and rural and vast ridings, we would keep the first past the post system. And therefore, there would perhaps be 40 to 60 MPs that would be elected in this way. For the other more urban areas, we could group 4 to 5 current ridings. And in those ridings, when they vote, voters would choose their 4 or 5 MPs based on the results of the vote. I'm not necessarily defending this position until the bitter end, but in that case, every voter would vote for one candidate or one party. The party would be chosen by the new riding association that would group together the 4 or 5 ridings to achieve gender parity. Let us say that there are 5 available seats. There would need to be 3 men and 3 women, and the party would have to alternate them man, woman, always alternating between a man and a woman. The voter would vote, as they do now, for one candidate or one party. They would only have one vote, and from there, we would establish that 60% of people vote for Party A, and therefore they get 3 seats. 60%. Ms. May.
Sharon, it's an honour to have you here, Mr. Kingsley. Thank you so much. I'm just going to pick up on, and I will come back to your proposition. Since we do have the possibility of asking you something pretty direct, I wanted to know if you believe, with your experience as our Chief Electoral Officer in the past, that with the distortions that we experience under first past the post, do you believe our democracy will be improved when we get rid of first past the post?
I think that our democracy will be improved once the work of your committee, and I'm not going to hedge, I'm going to say what I think. Once the work of your committee is done and a decision is made by Parliament and Canadians about where what is the best system or the least worst system, as Shakespeare would have said, that is ours. I attach a lot of importance to the process that's being followed here. And, you know, I've raised issues, values that I think are fundamental. And how you address them is because you represent the people, I don't. That's your job. And I don't want to preempt that by saying one thing or another. Democracy will be improved once we might make a final decision.
Thank you. But you have certainly concentrated in your opening statements on the distortions within the first-past-the-post system, that 40% of the vote gets 60% of the seats, or as Mr. Christofferson puts it quite rightly, 100% of the power. You noted in your introduction that another preoccupation of Canadians lately has been concern about the power of a Prime Minister's office. I wondered if you wanted to expand on that, because that's an almost unique feature of the Canadian system, even as compared to other Westminster systems.
Yeah. Well, I was highlighting several aspects that have come forward for a number of years about how power is concentrated, and the system that was established by Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and I was a middling public servant at the time, but I was participating in this. It was meant to ensure that there was a unity of direction on the part of a government, as opposed to ministers flying off and going in contrary directions, or going in directions that were contrary to what the party wanted. And presumably this must have been occurring because he saw this as being a necessity. And that machinery over time created a situation with various prime ministers over time, utilizing it more to centralize the authority of the prime minister. And a lot of people consider that to be problematic in our democracy. But that's not directly related to the particular issue here, but it is part of what is feeding into, and I consider this to be natural and part of democracy, the need to review certain elements of our democracy. And the strength of our democracy is the ability to do so, including that particular issue.
Well, thank you. I wanted to go back to the line of questioning that my friend Scott Reid was asking, and just clarify your view on our current Referendum Act. So just to clarify, it's your view that while Parliament can certainly decide to hold a referendum on electoral reform, we would have to revisit, revise, and amend our current Referendum Act before we could do that. Is that a correct statement of your view?
Yeah. Well, we would have to do that even if we were to raise it as a constitutional question, because there's references in there that no longer apply, and they need to be rectified by Parliament. And so at the same time, we would allow an opportunity to review the financing regime and other aspects. By the way, I will say that that regime was exceedingly good in the allocation of free broadcast time. I think it set Canada apart so well in its Referendum Act. It would set us apart. The 1 hour and a half to both sides, the broadcasting arbitrator being able to allocate time to everyone who was interested in getting broadcast time. They had to get the money to put up their ads and to prepare their ads, but they did not have to pay the broadcasters. And this was such a deep strength of our Referendum Act.
I think I have time, about 40 seconds left. I wanted to ask about your comment around our Section 3 charter right to vote, and that we also, as you put it, I think we have a right to effective representation, and the Supreme Court has commented on this. Is it your view that under our current system of first past the post, that some voters have a right to wonder whether their vote was an effective representation?
We have 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, it is my view that we owe an explanation to the people who feel that way, and they're numerous. There's many, many people. Fair Vote Canada, they encompass a lot of other organizations. We need to bring them into the fold somehow.
Thank you. Ms. Romanato.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here. And while I haven't known you as long as Mr. Reid, we've just met, I did appreciate your presentation. You mentioned a couple of criteria or suggestions for us, one being relative simplicity of the ballot, two, the link between elector and elected, and you elaborated a little bit on that, and three, the need to reinforce coast-to-coast representation in political parties, cabinet, and caucus. I'd like to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, what I'm alluding to is the fact that right now in the Western provinces, people voted one way. There's a representation that's here. And some parties are underrepresented. So there's bodies missing in caucus.
Yeah.
If we go to Eastern Canada, the reverse is there. If we go to Quebec, same thing. There are fewer conservatives than should be there. And I'm saying we lose out because it's at the caucus that national decisions are made, at least by the parties that have a national ambit. And that's part of what they want to do. They don't want to represent regions. And I'm saying we need to facilitate that. And one way would be to do some kind of proportional or mixed proportional system, including the suggestion, not the proposal, that I've made, where we would achieve that to a large degree, not to a full extent. Okay? But again, we must realize no system we devise, no matter what it is, will be perfect.
Okay. So you actually answered the second part of my question, if there was a suggestion on how we could address that. How would the coast-to-coast representation affect intra-party competition?
Intra-party?
Yeah, you mentioned, the avoid battles.
This was an allusion that I was making to what is called an open list, which is where electors rank within the same party which one they prefer.
Okay.
And I'm saying if I were a candidate, now I've never been a candidate, but if I were a candidate and, my name was on that list 5th and I'm expecting only 4 to be elected, I would really bust my proverbial to be amongst the first 4.
Okay.
And I would, there would be some temptations. I'm sure you face some temptations in your electoral things when it comes time to doing certain things. Of course, party discipline might come in, but we know what that gives. So that's what I meant, okay? And so I'm really saying you have to think about this very seriously if you want to see that introduced into the whole game, where within the same party at election time, people are choosing in between the candidates of the same party. What that does to that campaign at that level.
Okay. Do I still have some time? Okay. You also talked a little bit about the importance of that rapport between the elector and the elected. I myself had 7 candidates in my riding, including myself, and benefited from first past the post. That's the reality. And regardless of who voted for me or who didn't vote for me, I represent them all, in my view. So I keep that direct representation, and I think that the onus is on the elected official after the fact to maintain that rapport regardless of who voted for them. So I'm curious what system you think would address that if we already have that commitment, and I'm pretty sure my colleagues around the table have that commitment regardless of who voted for you, who didn't, we have that rapport already established.
Well, there are systems that would allow for some kind of direct rapport. What I'm saying to you is you must weigh very carefully if it's going to be a system which is equated with mainly proportional. I mean, in other words, 30 seats are going to be decided in this particular province or whatever by a proportional system. 30 seats, 170 candidates, I don't know, whatever it is, multiplied by 7, 210 candidates, whatever. What is the link that exists between the elector and the elected amongst those 30? But to come back to the suggestion that I made, if you're choosing 4 or 5, is it possible to consider that to be a linkage which is acceptable, where the elector can know and can easily reach one elected MP, might even be able to choose amongst the 4 or 5 which one he or she prefers to carry his or her issue, or appeal to all 5 when it comes time to representing a particular point of view of national import.
Thank you. Mr. Deltel.
C'est un grand honneur pour moi de vous rencontrer.
It is an honor to meet you. I've known you for decades now. However, contrary to MP Reid, it's the first time that I've shaken your hand. Mr. Kingsley.
Donc, un processus juste.
You said that we need a fair process. What do you mean by fair process? Especially when we're talking about changing our way of voting. What I mean, Mr. Deltel. And as an aside, I saw you in the provincial scene with a lot of respect in Quebec. Now back to your question. What I mean by that is exactly what you're currently doing. You're discussing alternatives. You're giving sway to the advantages and the disadvantages of each system, because there is not a one single perfect system. And you are now trying to decide to see what is the best system for Canadians. This committee must ensure that Canadians are aware of your deliberations, so they can also know what the recommendations are. Canadians should be able to have their say. I want there to be a two-way communication. I would go even further, saying that Canadians' voices must be analysed in an intelligent way. There are companies that specialise in intelligently analysing what people say rather than just simply publishing a report without a true evaluation. There are ways to evaluate this. Yes, thank you, Mr. Kingsley. Canadians need to be aware of our deliberations. What I would like to say is that people in my riding were surprised to see that I would come to Ottawa twice for this committee. People are already starting to understand what we're doing. You are also saying that we need to carry out an intelligent analysis. Do you believe that in only a few months, because we have a very strict timeline, do you think that with this strict calendar we can truly have a fair process? Because we only have a mere few months to conduct this very important analysis, as you put it. Like the Latin people said, tempo sugit. However, for all intents and purposes, you have a very tight schedule. As a parliamentary committee, you have access to all that has been done, all systems that have been considered in the past, and systems that other Canadians wish to provide to you. I think that you should take them into account very seriously. And on top of that, I think this is perfectly plausible. You will have to be here during the summer, which is the case. And then we will see. I cannot guarantee, but I think that this is a possibility. A few seconds ago, you stated what you think is good. Do you really believe that such a significant electoral reform should be in the hands of parliamentarians? Should it not be in the hands of Canadians? In my comment, I talked about Canadians, Mr. Deltel. Perhaps I should have mentioned it first. I was following, by putting it at the end, a certain logic with regard to the process that you have to follow here. The way that one can reach what Canadians want, because we are in a representative democracy, is that there should be a consultation, which is what you have been encouraged to do in your ridings, so that your deliberations can be fueled by what Canadians think. How Canadians feel about what you're doing and what you will propose. Yes, I understand that we have a tight schedule. Also note that we have to follow the logic whereby parliamentarians have work to do. However, at the end of the day, it is Canadians who will give us information, and it is up to them to decide. You led Elections Canada for 17 years, and so what is the most important for you? A consultation process with town halls in a cafeteria? Or a referendum where all Canadians can have their say? 10 seconds. We indeed have a tight schedule. I cannot give you an answer in just 10 seconds. Perhaps I could give you an answer during the second round. To you, Ms. Soto.
Thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here today. After the 2000 federal election, we saw a very low voter turnout rate, and you had stated that perhaps compulsory requirements should be made at that time. I'd like to ask you what you think about the decrease in voter turnout. However, I think in this 2015 election we have had a little bit of a bounce back in voter turnout, which is great. Would electoral reform results increase, participating in electoral reform, perhaps getting a new system in place, would that increase voter turnout, do you believe? And I know that you referred to, in your intro, you talked about perhaps not compulsory voting, but compulsory attendance. So you can phrase it in that terms, I guess, if you like.
Well, I wanted to frame it in those terms because that is what should be the reality. I don't believe in compulsory voting where you have 5 candidates, you must vote for one of the 5. I made that very clear. Now, in the year 2000, when I expressed myself with the media, and it took me 16 years to come back to that particular issue in a sense, I said that we should be considering it. I did not say we should do it. There was an alarm that I wanted to send, and that alarm I sent again today, because of the need for legitimacy of the result. I don't know if 50% attendance at the polls is sufficient to lend legitimacy to a government. 50% of the people voted, 39% voted for the governing body, it got 58% of the seats. At a moment in time, you start to say, what's going on? So that's why I made that comment at the time. It was branded as though I'd recommended it. That is not the fact. I'm not recommending it today either. I've given you what I consider to be, things to consider. I don't make these decisions on behalf of other people, but I will express my views about the factors to take into account and the values that's assumed that. Now, there was another part of your question which I've overlooked. And
do you think voter turnout would increase? I mean, actually, I have a question from Twitter too. I should give a shout out to Andrew Campbell, who asked me a Twitter question about how much higher would voter turnout be or is voter turnout in countries that have proportional representation, if you do have those facts, or what your view or opinion is if we had a change, would voter turnout actually increase? Because essentially that's what we want. We want people to participate in the democratic process. We want their voice to be heard. So we need an increase in voter turnout in order to do so. Would this result in that?
Yeah. Well, I remember reading some studies, at least there was one, I think it was Professor Blais, who did a study, and I think initially there was a view of about 7%, but I don't know if this has been sustained over time. I may even be wrong about the percentage that I'm talking about. There was a view that it might tend to increase it. I think that is it. But there was also a view that it would be marginal. So I don't know where the answer is on that front. Okay.
Well, in your opinion, I mean, that is the reason we have you here as a witness, not to impose a system on us, but to get your expert opinion, because you did serve us for so many years. And in your view, would a certain system be, I know you talked about simplicity of the ballot, so would a certain system be more prone to get more people out to voting?
It's possible that one system as opposed to another might have a slight increase or a slight impact on voter turnout. But because you're asking me the question directly, what really matters is that if we're going to keep a voluntary system of voting, we simply have to get to young people. They were voting at 38% at the previous election, and it was on a downward trend. It went up to around 58 at the last election. And that made a difference, by the way. I'm not assuming that, I'm not saying only young people were amongst that group, but the 58% was young people. And we're simply not reaching out to them. We're not succeeding. You, the candidates, are not succeeding. You, the political parties, we, the political parties, are not succeeding in reaching out to them where they live. They no longer communicate like we communicated. And they have to have an appreciation of what it's all about. I alluded to this in my earlier remarks. If we're going to keep a voluntary system of attendance at the polls, we simply need to do more to reach out to people about the importance of voting, not only how to, but why this is tied to democracy. So the educational system, the relationship between young people, how they relate to one another. I mean, they don't relate to television. We know that.
Merci.
Why do we still do television?
Merci. On passe maintenant à M. Boulris.
Mr. Boulris, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here with us this afternoon. I have to say that I have been involved since 1990 in the electoral process, so you've always been mystery elections for me from the early years when I was working as a volunteer. We are talking about an extremely important subject. This has something that has an impact on what Canadians do and the choices they make, but it's nonetheless a subject that's not well understood. We are here, we're talking about this, there's people who are following it in their offices, there's people who are here who are interested in the subject, absolutely, but it's not something that's easily understood by everybody in Canada. People sometimes think that they're voting directly for the Prime Minister, for example, whereas in fact they're voting for a candidate in the elections. So here we are, we're approaching this major reform. This is something that the NDP supports. We support consultations, and we support also public education, because people need to know what it is we're actually talking about. And that's something that can't only be done by this committee, because not all Canadians, indeed not even the majority of Canadians, will be following the work of this committee. So the government, perhaps, do you not think, should take the means to explain in greater detail to people what we're doing? Answer. Yes, the Minister had talked about the $8 to $10 million that was assigned to a specific purpose, and then there was of that an amount of money assigned to this committee. I think the committee absolutely has a responsibility. I agree the government has a responsibility. The government's the government. But this committee also has an extremely important responsibility, and I think Parliament as a whole has a responsibility to reach out to electors. It's not simply to say that it's for the government. Yes, the government have a role to play, but you also need to assume a strong role to have a mechanism to share the information you ought to have available to you, a means also of receiving information so you can hear what Canadians have to say about this, so people can follow what you're doing. And the Canadians who are following this can hear the different views. This is something that's extremely important, and the media are involved, and that will get the message out if you go into social networks, because that's, after all, the natural habitat of young people. Then there will be a snowball effect, and the word will get out, and the people will understand. Okay, this is how it works. I have spent my life writing. And something I say repeatedly is that the Canadian electors are reasonable. They're reasonable people. They will understand. This is at the basis of our system, this point that Canadians are capable of understanding what democracy is about. That's at the heart of the system, because otherwise why would we have a democratic system? The Canadian population can understand this. Question. Last December, there was a survey carried out, and we saw that the people spoke about the importance of recognising plurality within Parliament, and they spoke about the importance of reducing distortions that are generated by the first-past-the-post system. But people also spoke about wanting to have a simple system, having a member of Parliament that represented a specific locality, a specific region, and so there would be this contact. Based on your experience, what type of system can bring together these two principal concerns that Canadians have highlighted? Answer. I'm not going to say that I favour one particular model, but there is, of course, the mixed system, which allows you to elect a member based on a specific geographic area, and then there's a certain number of seats that are established under proportional representation. I think it's 75 seats that would be done in one way based on the riding, and the other on proportional representation, and that was in one province. That's one option. And what you have to do with it when you're looking at any of the options is ask, is this something that's acceptable? Are you managing to maintain the link between the Member of Parliament and the community? That's the sort of work that you're going to do. Look and see what isn't suitable, what's not the right way to go ahead. Mr. Richards, please.
I just wanted to return, you were talking, I forget who it was that asked you the question actually, but you were talking about the system that sort of you had suggested. I know you said it wasn't a proposal you're making, but the one where we would sort of have two different sort of types of systems, one for sort of urban parts of the country, one for I guess what we'll call rural parts of the country. I have a few questions around that, but the first one I guess would be, you know, you sort of explained what you would see that system do, how it would work, but you didn't really give us any sense as to why we should look at that, or why that's a good system for Canada. What would be your rationale for such a system?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to elaborate on what I was saying. And the reason I call it a suggestion is because I have not had the resources to analyze this. This is huge, to analyze the implications of a system like this across the land. I'd be more than willing to do that quite voluntarily if I were provided some resources, by the way. That's up to you to decide. But effectively, what I'm saying is, if there's a new riding of 5 existing ridings, okay, and in all 5, the winning candidate came in with 40% of the votes, okay, and it's all with the same party. Assume that. That's 100% of the seats. If that were run with 5 seats joined.
Sure, no, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, because I understood that part. What I was trying to get a sense of is, like, you know, obviously you're proposing sort of 2 separate systems. You're proposing one that would be sort of for urban areas and one that would be for more rural or remote areas. So I was trying to get a sense as to why you felt that was that the hybrid of those 2 things was a good idea for Canada.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question.
No problem.
I'm basing it on a perception which may not be fair. Certainly I've had people come up to me after I've explained the system or suggested it that they don't agree with my basic thesis, but I'm saying that people who live in rural areas, people who live in remote areas, are very accustomed to that direct link between themselves and the elected. And to put them into a proportional type of system represents more difficulty for them in accepting that, because already geographically the expanse of those ridings is too huge to be covered by one person beyond, you know, and they would see my vote is going to be subsumed to all those urban votes. Now, I may be wrong about this. Certainly some people have come up to me after I made presentation and said, I'm a rural person, I would prefer to vote proportionately. I respect that, but that was the basis for my proposal.
And I appreciate the comments about the rural seats. I think that you've hit on something important. You mentioned earlier about you figured about 40 to 60 of those might be in the country. I would actually argue I think you're probably quite low on that in terms of the number of rural seats in the country. I think if I looked at it, you know, even my province of Alberta, I would say if you were to do this way, at least half of the seats would be, so that'd be, you know, 16 to 18 seats would be done that way, probably, you know. So there's one province, right? So you'd probably be a bit low. So I'm wondering how if you've given any thought, and maybe you haven't, but if you have, could you elaborate for us on how you would sort of see those seats being allocated in the urban areas? Like, in other words, what would you set a certain barrier of a certain population above this population, that city would then be multi-member districts, or how would you do that? Or have you given thought to that?
Well, I have given some thought to that, and under the present system, we have a quotient, and we would continue to respect the quotient. And for rural and remote areas, we would exceed the quotient whenever necessary, because that's what the law allows those commissions, boundary commissions. They're allowed that leeway. And I would simply clump under the present system. I would take the present system, take 5 existing ridings, bunch them into one. Now, I heard the Chief Electoral Officer say he thought that might need redistribution as well because of community of interest. I will tell you one thing about community of interest. It is the most nebulous of factors, and is the most difficult for those commissions to put into place, because it varies depending upon the perception. And I defy anybody to define it in precise terms, anybody in Canada, to define what is community of interest. There's a feeling. Now, when you regroup 5, this is what you would have. And you could use the present quotient to say...
Sure. Would you argue, though, that you're saying you find anyone to put it?
We're kind of running out of time.
Would you agree that that's an important thing to consider, though, the idea of community of interest, or?
Well, I would agree that it's an important thing to consider, and not just to do it, without thinking about it. It's a matter to be thought of. Does it necessitate redistribution? That is the thing that should be considered very seriously.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Aldag now.
Great, thank you. This question comes from Twitter, and I'd like your thoughts on it. The question is simply, how do independents fit in any sort of new system? A lot of the work we've talked about, it relates to parties, and do you have any thoughts on independence and the future of our electoral system?
This is a major consideration on the international scene. With proportional systems, with purely proportional systems. It seems to obviate, and I think some solutions were found, but I can't remember what they are. But in mixed member, it is not an issue, because you can still run as an independent in this particular. In the example I've given, you could also have independents. Their chances of being elected, by the way, are probably the same as they are right now. Okay, there's not going to be a system where we can devise, at least not readily, where independence would rule the day. Okay, but it is important for that phenomenon to be able to express itself under our system, and there are various systems which allow that quite readily.
Okay, thank you. In your opening comments, you made a statement that, from your perspective, online voting is coming, and I'd like to get your thoughts a bit more on that. We heard earlier today that. The current chief electoral officer is not, foreseeing online voting for 2019. And what makes you think that it is coming, and in what sort of horizon would you say that we will be facing online voting in Canada?
Well, it's going to be later than we think, and it's going to be faster than we think. We're living our lives at the end of these gizmos. We were doing everything, so it's just a natural thing, and I've indicated how important it's going to be to devise the right control mechanisms to ensure that the person who's voting is the person who registered, who's entitled to vote. We're going to have to, is it going to be a photo of the iris, as I said, or something else, fingerprints? Fingerprints are problematic because that's tied to our criminal system. Some jurisdictions, new democracies, have no problem at all with doing that. And I'm saying it's coming because it's pervasive, and people will expect that will become a reality. And if it doesn't, there will be problems. Now, the chief electoral officer said cannot do it for 2019. Number one, he needs the permission of the House of Commons and the Senate before he even thinks about it. And it used to be just this committee, or the PROC, Committee of Parliament, of the House of Commons. Now it's been extended to the two bodies, so he can't even test it. So I don't blame him for saying 2019 he cannot do it.
Okay. Along with the comments we heard this morning on online voting, one of the suggestions was to pilot and looking at perhaps groups. One of them that was mentioned was persons with disabilities, or there were others. If we were to do a phased-in approach, would there be a suggested approach that you would prefer? Would there be a group over another, or how could we phase something in if we needed to take that approach?
Well, the initial consideration would be that it not apply generally to a whole group, and by that I mean to Canadian population. People opt in if they want to. That would be too broad. But if you can restrict it to 1, 2, 3, 5 ridings, whatever, and to people with differing abilities. By the way, that's a Mexican expression. Instead of disabled, they say differing abilities. I like that a lot. It could be those groups that do it, or people who have mobility issues and who will be able to say, well, I have a mobility issue, and we would take their word for it. People don't lie about these things. And so we would be able to, envelop that with control mechanisms that we could then check to see how well we performed and how well received it was by the elector, by the way. How much easier was it for the elector? I mean, if it's more burdensome than the present system, then why bother, So that's how I would go about it.
Okay,
and I
thanks.
talked about parallel systems, by the way, so that we can control that what's going in, what people are manifesting as their choice is really what is being manifested at the other end.
Okay. Another question I heard you ask.
At the end,
can
maybe
be
a
really
comment?
fast.
No comment, yeah, and then maybe it can come up again.
Sure. You'd simply said, what margin of error is acceptable? You put that to us, and I was going to put it back to you. What margin of error is acceptable?
Well, wittingly or otherwise, under the present system, there is a margin of error. It is exceedingly slim, and it is not something which is mathematically ascertainable. But if we try to convince Canadians to go and vote online as a general population, they will say, I want 0% error.
Yes.
That is going to be their expectation.
Okay.
And that's why we need to develop slowly over time so that we, and then rapidly, more rapidly than we thought, so that people have confidence that we know what we're doing and that I would call it the sanctity of our electoral system is being preserved.
Merci. On va lancer la deuxième. Non, non, non.
We're going to move on to the second round of questioning now. Mr. de Courcy. Thank you again, Mr. Chair.
To the issue that we left off on, which is the relationship between elector and elected, which in my mind correlates nicely with the principle, one of the principles that we've been tasked with exploring in the mandate, which is the importance of local representation. And I would echo the comments of my colleague Sherry, who speaks to the good faith effort that I think all parliamentarians undertake to represent the voices of their communities. And being a representative from Atlantic Canada on this committee, I know that we as elected officials in Atlantic Canada hold ourselves accountable to our communities quite closely, and our electors understand well the link that they have with their elected representatives. Two questions, given that preface. In the proposed system that you've mused about a little bit, how do you envision Atlantic Canada being divided in some of the larger centres versus some of the rural areas in the single member and mixed member riding system that you touched on? And I'll give you a second to perhaps answer that.
Well, with respect to your first point about your members of parliament representing the whole population, I agree that this is a reality, and I've seen it, and I believe it. But I also happen to believe that when the Conservatives get together to discuss something in caucus, you're not there. And I think that is important. That's what I meant by having representation that represents globally what people in Atlantic Canada. Insofar as how I would, how one would handle, under the suggestion that I've made, Atlantic Canada, first of all, I would respect provincial boundaries. Rule 1, don't fool around with provincial boundaries. You will get nowhere. Okay, this is Canada. Don't waste your time. And then each province would have to be looked at individually to see what is it that people think is rural and that is acceptable as being defined rural, and what is it that people think and accept is urban. And I'm not the one who would be making that choice, but I'm suggesting that that is a choice that could be made, that would reflect what people in each province would do. Does PEI go, all 4 seats are combined into one, or does it consider itself to be rural, all 4 seats? Let's ask the people of Prince Edward Island. Okay?
Great, thank you very much. The second part of my question has to do with the role of an elected representative, elected potentially through a proportionality system or on a list system, versus a colleague who may represent a similar area who is elected through a first past the post. Let's say we're in some sort of MMP. What is the role of that elected official on toward the electors vis-a-vis the person who is elected through first past the post who represents a particular constituency? So you've got person elected from the riding of Fredericton, and you've got person who may be from Fredericton elected through a proportionality list. What are the differing or similar roles that they have on toward the electors?
Well, I will conjecture with you. I will come and say there will be strong similarities between the two, and there will be important differences between the two. The advantage of the system now is that people feel that that member of parliament represents me. And this is the geographical area in which we're contained. Now, I'm not saying people know who that MP is in urban settings. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a way of reaching out to that person. There's a way of knowing, I can let that person know that if he says or she says that again, I'm not going to vote for them again. That is power.
And they do.
They do, yes. If it's an election for members at large, and my recollection is that that is where the word ombudsman comes from. Because those members of parliament were less owing to individual electors. They knew that if it's a closed system, where they were on that list at the next time around mattered more. Now, that doesn't mean that they did not consider what was in the best interest of their countries. That's not what it meant.
Thank you.
It meant that the link with the individual elector is different.
Thank you.
Qualitatively.
We'll go to Mr. Reid now.
Regarding the system you have discussed, I know you were at a meeting and presented it in February, a meeting organized by the Senate. But has it been published anywhere? Is there a printed version of what you're describing, or will there be at any point in the near future?
I've been very careful not to publish anything on that front. But as I've indicated, I'd be more than willing to do some work if I were assigned some resources. This is not an easy task to accomplish. It cannot be accomplished by one person, by me, within severe time frames, or even over time. It requires concentration, so it's not published. There are some variations that exist. I think that Minister Dion had something equivalent to this. I will not say that it is the same. I do not wish to blame him for anything here. I'm just saying I think that is something that is on his website. There are variations on this. By the way, different numbers of different people have gotten in touch with me, different organizations. Some of them are in the room, suggesting variations on this similar theme, and I think they're worth hearing. So that's the status of that.
Okay. From what you've said, I've been going through the models that I can think of out there in my mind, and the one it seemed to be most like is the STV model proposed in British Columbia that was the subject of a referendum in 2005, the so-called BC STV model. Am I right in making a rough approximation, or have I missed the point in doing that?
I would have to look at that model again before I would comment on that. I've not looked at it recently, but I'd be willing to do that and give you some my feedback on that. I will remind people, by the way, because people keep saying, the referendum in British Columbia was not successful for change. The first referendum, 57% of the people of British Columbia voted in favor of change, but the Premier said you need 60. Otherwise, you don't get it. So, you say to yourself, it's never worked. People have never wanted change. They have wanted more than 50%, significantly more. 7% means 14% in my books difference.
Well, you're right about that. Actually, you've said yourself that it hasn't. I have always defended referendum, and your comment gives me a chance to just say something that I think is important. In British Columbia, you're quite right. 57% voted in favor, so that was the majority. They were prevented by an artificial 60% threshold from getting their way, and I disagree with artificially high thresholds. But additionally, the turnout in that referendum was over 60%. So this nonsense that somehow people do not participate in referenda on electoral reform is just not true. Over 70% voted in the New Zealand referendum. In fact, over 80% in the New Zealand referendum on changing to an STV, or rather to a MMP system from first past the post. What I would notice and observe to everybody is that on this committee is that when a model has a very low percentage supporting it, such as the Ontario model in 2007, it only had about 35%. It also normally has a very low turnout. So I think we can safely interpret many of the people who did not vote as saying, I'm not even going to vote on this. I'm so uncompelled by this model. when people find the model compelling, not only do they vote in favor, but they turn out in very large numbers to vote. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. I would have liked to have made that to the minister yesterday. I do have a 1 minute left, and I wanted to ask you this. You've talked about avoiding redistribution by grouping a number of existing ridings together, and that, of course, makes a significant degree of sense as a way of speeding things up. I want to ask the same question that my colleague asked to Mr. Miron earlier. There is one particular community of interest that appears to have a right to have the retention of community of riding boundaries in a way that is potentially can be used in litigation, and that is official language linguistic minorities. The case that arose in Acadie-Bathurst, where a number of people, including the incumbent member of parliament, said they found the change in boundaries to be unacceptable. I guess that the concern I have is this: is it a danger that we could find an attempt to merge ridings subject to that kind of litigation, and therefore slowing down the process?
Very quickly.
Well, the answer is there's danger legally and practically anything that you will do, and some of it will be on constitutional grounds. People will find ways if they're not happy. That is something that will have to be we will have to live with, and that includes that. By the way, that case deserves to be studied much more carefully than what we're able to do today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Christopherson.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to go back a little bit to the comments of Ms. Romanado, in response to my comments, and it was to the effect that you represent all your constituents, and it's like, yeah, that's sort of a given. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that if someone who's a known New Democrat phones Mr. Reid, and I'll use him because he's the longest serving member in Parliament on this committee, they're going to get fantastic service, no different than if his neighbour. I have no doubt about that. And if a known Conservative calls my office, I'd be mortified to find out that they felt they got less than. What I'm talking about is something far more important, and that is the actual division of power. Because you can't get re-elected if you don't represent everyone. What we're talking about is, here's power in Canada. How does it get divvied up? And I was on my feet in, I believe, the 38th, 39th, and 40th Parliament prior to the arrival of Madame May, and she knows where I'm going here. And I would stand up and I would say there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who voted in my riding for the Greens, and people across the country voted for the Greens, and at that time the number was about 500,000 people, and there wasn't one member in the House that was from the Green Party. That matters, because while Mr. Reid may do a fantastic job representing that constituent on their VET problem or on their Canada Revenue problem or on their EI problem, he is not going to be there for them when it comes to standing up and saying, I want proportional representation. Conversely, in my riding, that same Conservative voter is going to get that same service from me on those issues, but when I stand up, I am not going to be defending first past the post. We just voted on assisted dying. Incredibly divisive issue. You can't vote both ways. At the end of the day, whoever got the seat got to cast that vote either in favor or opposed, and it couldn't be both. And so that's why I said that there's 43% of the population in my riding. I like to think they get good service. I'm in my 5th term. There's enough of them that think that or I wouldn't be here. But in terms of reflecting those policies of the parties that the constituents have voted against me for supported, that voice is not there. I am going to support doubling CPP from here to the end of eternity until we get it. Mr. Reid would not. He feels differently about it.
Mr. Chair, point of order. We're here to question the witness here, not to indict Ms. Romanado on her comments.
Yeah, I would agree. Is there a
Really? Really?
Well,
we're talking about democratic reform, democracy. I've got my 5 minutes. I'm responding to a comment, and somebody's telling me I'm out of order?
I would like it if you directed it through the chair, maybe.
What's your problem now, Chair? Sorry?
If you could direct your comments through the chair, as opposed to, as opposed to...
Through you,
yes,
sir,
thank you, I appreciate
Mr.
it.
Chair, to Madame Romanado, who I was responding to.
Yes.
Now, someone may feel that that's not the right response, but it's my 5 minutes, because I'm the one that has the seat.
No, I understand that.
So, fine, I'm done anyway.
Okay,
you
but
spent more time berating me than letting me finish my thought.
I wasn't berating you.
Now
Mr.
I do have a
Gustav.
question for our witness, through you, Chair.
Yes, thank
to
you.
our witness, you had said earlier, sir, that you weren't aware of any emerging democracies, where I've done a fair bit of work internationally too, that have actually chosen first past the post. Can you give us some of the reasons that you think they would be considering when they didn't go that way? Because there is a good argument they would look at Britain and Canada and say, hey, it worked for them, why wouldn't we go there? And yet, you're right, they're almost all going to some form of a parliamentary system. Can you give us your thoughts on why they would go that way in terms of trying to get the best democratic process from the very beginning when they're designing it, why they would not likely or why they haven't? What do you think some of the reasons they might have been considering when they made those decisions, sir?
The importance of multipartyism, to put it bluntly. And your example of 500,000 votes not getting one seat, in my introductory remarks, I said 700,000 votes only gets one seat. And we owe those Canadians an explanation if we're not going to change the system. We owe them that. And all the others who are concerned about 39 gets you 50 or 60. 39% of the votes get you 60% of the... We need an explanation for those people. This is a democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Your time's about up, but there'll be other opportunities. There'll be other opportunities.
You go to the end now.
No. Mr. Thériault, Monsieur Thériault.
Alors, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I asked for an extra minute this morning, but I did not have enough time. I had no time to thank Mr. Méran and tell him what I will say to Mr. Kingsley. First of all, I would like to thank you for your colossal contribution to the defense of the integrity of our electoral system. Mr. Méran this morning was saying that all voters had a lot of trust in the integrity of the system, and I think that you have contributed to this integrity. Mr. Méran also has contributed to this integrity. It was music to my ears when my colleague, Mr. Boulris, finally stated that we would need much more in order to engage all voters. Your answer was also music to my ear. I agree with what you said. You're giving us a responsibility. You said that we are the institution. We are more than an executive committee. You say that we are the institution that should pilot this electoral reform, and you should have more means, and I agree with you. Given our time frame, this is a rather monumental task. We'll do our best. Now I would like to hear what you have to say. At the beginning, you said that there was no perfect system, and we all agree. I've studied a good number of them. There are pros and cons to each one. At the end of the day, is it not up to Canadians to decide what the pros and cons are? The pros and cons that they want to accept. Is it not up to the population to decide upon this debate? Because this is not an debate for experts, and only of experts. Canadians need to have their say. Even if we try to give them information, and even if they give us information, we'll have to propose a model, but we must turn to Canadians to see whether the model will be satisfactory to them, and whether they wish to accept the pros and cons for the years to come. Will it therefore not be better to have a referendum at the same time as the next elections? I will drop the fact that I have already organised a referendum. I know what it means. I will not reiterate the pros and cons. As far as I see it, if this committee creates strong mechanisms to engage Canadians, the feedback and input received from Canadians and the preponderance it will have, we are in a representative democracy. I believe that there could be a unanimous report from the committee. This might seem strange, but I think that it is a possibility. A vast majority of the committee could agree with one proposal. It is your job to gauge what Canadians have to say. If that does not happen, if only one party agrees with something, then I would say that perhaps we should envisage other options. I do not see it as necessary as it stands. Currently, I do not think that it is essential. How much time do I have remaining? 45 seconds, including the answer. Well, simply to say, I find you refreshing and optimistic. We will take count of what you have said. There was a pre-bill in Quebec that defined a single defined model. And at the end of the day, we saw that there were certain stumbling blocks during the process, and we could not find a single solution. I think that currently, therefore, we have a lot of ground to cover. Thank you. Ms. May.
Chair. Permit me for a moment, Mr. Kingsley, just through the chair, to reflect on my own situation, because the Green Party has been used as an example here a number of times, and I want to put forward that actually my reasons for wanting proportional representation are not self-interested. I'm not that interested in seeing how my party does. What worries me is the health of democracy overall and the risk, which I think is real, of a party with a minority of public support gaining not just 60% of the seats, but in our system, 100% of the power. And that worries me more. So I just wanted to put that forward. The other thing I've noticed since I came into politics, which is only in the last 10 years, so I was in my 50s before I got involved in a political party, and I'd love your comments on this. What I've observed is that because of first past the post, because of the risk of strategic voting, because that we actually have a system that creates wedge issues, an incentive for wedge issues, or what people call dog whistle politics, that it works against working across party lines. It is a force against collaboration. And I wonder if you've observed this, or if you think it's just a personal view of mine that's off base. What's your view of the impact of first past the post on the ability to develop consensus-based politics?
Well, I've alluded to this when I said that we need a system whereby people are elected across the land when a party is of a national scope, so that we have voices from all regions of Canada. And the present system does not lend itself readily to that because of the success of multipartyism, and because our system allows regional parties to come to the fore. As a matter of fact, some of them come to the fore, and they're important, because that's the way people in that region feel. And that could almost be viewed as, how come we're in this situation? How come the main parties are not representing those views? Is one observation that one could make. The whole issue of wedge politics is something that has been coming up over time, and I consider it to be a natural temptation under our system. I mean, if I'm running for office and I need to get 40% of the votes, why do I go for 45? If I have to start modifying my position on things, I consider that natural.
Thank you. The other thing I wanted to pursue is this, and then forgive me if I would say that at this point your proposition of some rural seats remaining under first past the post and others being clustered for what is essentially a single transferable vote is something of a back of the envelope idea that one would love to pursue. But I think its benefit here to us, and correct me if I'm wrong, is in suggesting to this committee that there are hybrid systems available to Canada, that we can find a system that works uniquely for Canada. We needn't say we must take Germany's system or New Zealand's system, or the upper house of Australia or the lower house of Australia. We should look at what the specific Canadian needs are.
Well, that is precisely the point, Mr. Chairman, that I was making in my Mr. Chair, sorry, that I was making in my remarks. I don't think we're bound by anybody else's system. I don't think there's anything wrong with anybody else's system. I just happen to think that we have peculiarities in this country which are going to be very hard to reconcile if we just try to take somebody else's system and say, well, we think this can fit. It may be that that is possible, but I'm saying let us not be bound by that thinking. There is a way of doing something which is entirely Canadian. That's what we've done with our system. We were the first country in the world to have an independent chief electoral officer. We were ahead of the game before anybody else. I think it was 1948 that came after with India. And so it took a long time for people to catch on. And we've been at the forefront. Now we're dealing with a historical reality. We have first past the post. Here are some issues that people feel very strongly about, its drawbacks. Do we want to do anything else? I think that's fair.
In the time I have left, I'm going to put to you a question from Stephen Harrison from Victoria, BC, who sent this on Twitter, recognizing that you were Chief Electoral Officer in 2004 when the Law Commission made its recommendation on electoral reform. Would you care to comment on what you thought of their work at the time?
Well, Elections Canada collaborated very closely with the Reform Commission in the provision of information and not of advice. And it was not appropriate for the Chief Electoral Officer, at least in my view, to participate more actively in that. But in terms of their report, I think it is something that needs to be considered as a viable option, as something to which Canadians have already given thought, because many people were consulted on that process. This is what I meant when I said we've done a lot of work in Canada before. This is not an idea that has just fallen here and we have nowhere to go to find out. We've got a lot of stuff here that we can look at.
Thank you. Ms. Romanato.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kingsley, you mentioned that we need to reach our youth where they are, and you mentioned they're usually at the bottom of one of these. You also talked about that we need to make sure that they know the importance of voting and how to vote. You also mentioned a little bit about online voting, that we should start initially with electors with mobility issues, electors not in their riding, or Canadians abroad. So my thoughts are, if we're trying to reach an audience that had 58% participation, which was great last election, we want to keep them engaged, we want to keep them in the process, would it not make sense to open up potential online voting to them through that channel, because that's where they are? I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
It would make sense in terms of overall objectives of improving participation of electors. It would be very difficult to say that it makes sense in terms of the numbers that would apply. We must, first of all, understand what we're getting into by doing tests that are smaller, more easily controllable, more easily analyzable. Because if we let a whole segment of millions of people, because that's what numbers we're talking about, be able to apply, I would not recommend that at all.
Okay. Now, in terms of, we talked a little bit about the mandatory voting or mandatory attendance. In terms of that, how would we ensure, maybe you'll know more about the mechanism, how would we ensure that people are, in fact, registering? How would we reach them? How would the mechanics work in terms of making sure that we could actually implement a mandatory attendance? And what would it be? Would it be a reward system, or would it be a punishment system if you did not attend?
Well, it can either be reward or penalty. The Australians have decided that what they will do is they impose a minimal fine. I think it's the equivalent of $40 or $50, which is not tremendous. Okay. If you don't have a reason for not attending, an acceptable reason, then you can invoke that. In terms of controlling, that's very easy. You have a list of electors. And you know, which is 94, 95% complete. And someday we will have to find a way to relate to Statistics Canada as well, and to start, I'm not saying in light of whatever we want to do about compulsory voting or attendance at the polls. And by the way, we're not going to succeed in changing the terminology, so I'll call it compulsory voting. So someday we'll have to get more intertwined, and because we're picking up information that could be very useful on the electoral front in terms of maintenance of the list. We already have other data banks through which we're feeding information, which people voluntarily feed to Elections Canada. No one is put on the list unless they want to. Let's remember that.
Okay, and I've asked the same question to the Chief Electoral Officer this morning. In terms of our efficiency in leveraging technology to improve our electoral process, for instance, when it comes to compilation of votes or so on and so forth, could you elaborate in your thoughts on how we can at least think about improving the current system and or any system we do put in place to make it more efficient, more accurate, and so on and so forth? If you could elaborate.
Well, nothing is free, so I will feel free to tell you exactly what is possible. What is possible under our present system is voting machines with a paper copy. That would eliminate a lot of the rejected ballots that we have now, or ballots that are not acceptable because they're madly bad. People would have an opportunity to correct their mistake. They would be told you've made a mistake. If they still want the mistake to go ahead, it goes ahead. And you have a paper copy in order to be able to replicate totally the results. If there's a recount, if there's a contestation. As well, it would immensely increase the ease of counting. You know, you press on the button at the end of the day, the count is there. So many valid votes, this, and that. And that can be transmitted electronically to the returning office and to other offices as well. It could all be done very rapidly that way, but that means an investment. So that's one thing. We're going to have to get smarter about allowing people to vote at different places. We can have a list of electors on this thing for a riding very easily. We can have the whole of Canada on this little gizmo here if we wanted to.
Yeah.
But at least a riding bound, we would have an opportunity to do that within the riding. So there's ways that technology is opening up for us that I haven't even begun to think about.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Monsieur Deltel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to continue my conversation with Mr. Kinsley. There's something that worries me. For the past 2 days, people have said how important proportionality is and how everyone needs to be represented. And it's terrible how the Green Party only has one MP with all those votes. I would just like to remind you the mathematics of this committee. The Green Party has 100,000 votes and one representative. We received 5.6 million votes, 9.5 times more. We have 3 MPs on this committee, and so when we're talking about proportionality, then let us not forget that this committee is not mathematically fair, especially when we look at popular vote. Mr. Kingsley, now let us move back to our previous conversation. You said that it's important to have Canadians at the heart of our discussion. We are the first stage, however, we need to listen to Canadians. You were the Chief Electoral Officer. You presided 5 elections and 1 referendum. What is the best way to hear what Canadians have to say? Through referenda or just through mere town halls in a cafe? This here is an election. We are here in a representative democracy. The use of a referendum has been problematic. When we talked about the referendum in '92, we stated that it could only be used for a constitutional matter. We did not want it to be a commonality in our system. Now you're talking about the current process. I gave you the best answer already. Earlier, I gave you an answer about the consensus that this committee could create and the impact it could have. How can we gauge the impact of your work before Canadians? Yes, we can gauge this. There are companies that are specialists. I'm not talking only about pollsters, but companies that analyze in a deep way what people have responded. It has become an art, this analysis, and that is rather what I recommend. How many Canadians should participate in this consultation? What is the number of Canadians that would mean that we have heard enough Canadians when we are talking here about changing our electoral system? I can't give you an answer, I don't know. It will be gauged by a sentiment. When the medically assisted suicide bill came about, a certain consensus was put forward in our society. We could see it in editorials, in news articles, and in what people were saying amongst themselves. Society forges an idea of what is acceptable. And I personally believe that parliamentarians do not often go against the will of the people. That is what I personally believe. Basically, we said that we wanted a representative democracy. Well, exactly, Mr. Kingsley. If we're talking about societal consensus, perhaps we could get a consensus that everyone wants there to be a referendum. Many editorials, many analysts and observers say that the population needs a referendum. Some MPs also think the same thing. In 2012, the Minister of Global Affairs also said that this was the case.
Said clearly in the text that we shall ask Canadians to say what they think of that. Monsieur Kingsley, le temps file, j'aimerais peut-être...
Mr. Kingsley, time goes on. And so, you who have presided over 5 elections, you who have organised 1 referendum, I'm more interested in the electoral system. You have a new proposal, a proposal that should be studied, and I think that 26 months may not be enough to explain your system. However, with regards to the 5 elections over which you presided, do you believe that these elections did not truly represent the sentiment of Canadians? Because those elections led to a majority government. Well, we've gone over 5 minutes, so very rapidly, if you will. I strongly believe that those elections very much represented the will of the people as required by the current representative system. Thank you, Mr. Huta.
Following the conversation on referendums, just previously we had Mr. Reid talk about voter turnout in the last national referendum that we had, and I believe he said 60%. Now, to me, that doesn't seem like an overwhelming number. I mean, if anything, and when I was quoting media that had misrepresented you in the past, in 2000, you were concerned about the decline in voter turnout, and rightfully so. I mean, we're all, as parliamentarians, I think a lot of Canadians are concerned about voter turnout, and that's why we're trying to improve our electoral system. However, in this last election, we had a 68.5%, and we're still trying to improve on that. So 60% turnout on a referendum doesn't seem to be all that great to me. I mean, we need to try to reach out to a lot of people that we're talking about, youth in particular, those that are disadvantaged that don't turn out at the polls. How do we get to know what they are thinking, and how do we get their input on the matter, and going forward, how do we get them to participate in our electoral process? And that's why we're trying to better our system so that we can be more inclusive, which is a mandate of this committee. So I'd like to get your opinion about whether you think referendum turnout is adequate and whether that is the best way to get an answer. I mean, I've been following what you've been saying, so it seems like, you were impressed by the depth that we're going into in this committee, and that is definitely a good start that we're taking. What kind of comment do you have about the referendum turnout?
Yes, Mr. Richards.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think it's always important, of course, that the record be accurate when the testimony or anyone is having the floor in this committee. And I had noted Ms. Soda had mentioned a number that was inaccurate, and it took me a second to find the number. And so I just wanted to point out that in the last federal referendum, it was actually 72% turnout in the last federal referendum. So there was, I believe, over 20 million people and almost 14
It's
million.
not a point of order, but it's noted.
I just wanted to make the record clear.
Okay.
So 72%.
Yeah, got it. Mr. Kingsley.
Okay, well, I mean, I was just going off of what a comment that was previously made. Upon Googling the numbers, I think you can come to 70%, about 71 point something. You know, we've done better in elections before too, so I'm not saying it's anything to be, you know.
But your question to
stunned about.
Mr. Kingsley stands. I mean,
It stands,
yeah.
yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Kingsley.
Well, I'm going to be very blunt about this. It was 72 at the federal referendum. That could have been considered satisfactory. It was 72 in Great Britain, and that is unsatisfactory. The matter is, how important is the question to the society? And that impacts on the turnout and the legitimacy of the results. It cannot be a simple answer of just one number being reached. The portent of the question, okay, has to weigh on what is an acceptable participation rate.
And so my follow-up question to that would be, and with this matter, what would you think would be an acceptable participation rate, knowing that on our previous referendum we had 72?
I've not gone in that direction in my thinking at this stage. I've indicated to you before that my hope is that my wish is that this committee comes out with a unanimous recommendation, if not an overwhelming majority consensus. And if not, I'll be more than happy to come back and tell you what I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that is really important because we are trying to make sure that we have good engagement from all sides of the spectrum. I'd like to get your input more about how we can get marginalized people involved, whether it's Aboriginal people or new Canadians or young people. I know you talked about electronic voting or online voting, but what are some other methods that can also be used in a new electoral process?
In 25 seconds, please.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the portent, the meaning of your question.
What strategies can we use going forward? What should we
very quickly?
Look at?
Yeah, please.
We need to get more involved in the communities where these people live. As a system, we need to do that, as political parties and as candidates. They are regrouped. They're not alone. They don't understand our system. They don't understand, and we could do a lot more at citizenship teaching about our electoral system and our system of representation.
Actually, Mr. Mayrand made the same point this morning. I don't know, I believe you were listening. More civics, more civics. Monsieur Boulris.
Merci, Monsieur le... Thank you, Chair. I'd like to seize the opportunity to react to what Mr. Diltel had to say for 30 seconds. The inequities in this committee and its makeup are also the inequalities of our House that comes from the current voting system. The NDP convinced the Liberals to relinquish their majority. However, we would not have had to do so were we to have a system that reflected the votes that we actually obtained. In 1979, the Commission recommended the mixed proportional system, just like the Law Commission proposed in 2004, with 2/3 of directly elected MPs and 1/3 of MPs elected through a list. The Germans have used this system for about a decade now, with about a 50-50 split. Half the votes are therefore a vote for a list. Some people have certain issues with this, whereby it would create 2 levels of MPs with 2 levels of legitimacy. With your experience on the international scene, how are these people perceived? How are these 2 different types of MPs perceived, those who have been elected in different ways? I can only answer using information I've heard from the 2 different MPs. They have perceived a difference based on who they represent. It is clear as a mountain spring. they do not have the same role. Though this is merely based on conversations I've had, it is not data from a poll. Yes, they do believe that they have a different role. Their roles are not identical. With regards to the possibility of voting on a second ballot for a party rather than a candidate, there are many ways to do so. An open list, for example, closed lists where the party decides on the order of candidates, and lists whereby the voter themselves decides to vote for the Liberal Party and then ordinates the candidates as they please. Do you believe that one system is better than the other in this kind of mixed proportional system?
As I said, that you have to be very careful on what you decide to do, because Canadians will have difficulty relating to closed lists unless it's a very short list, but even then it could be difficult. With an open list, that raises other issues that I referred to earlier regarding to intra-party competition. But that's not to say we ought to dismiss these options out of hand just because of that. We have to look at what benefits we'll get from it. What benefits will you get? What will be the strong points? What will be the disadvantages? Question. The government that was elected in October has a low number of women, 26% of women. We are trailing the other countries. We are at the 49th position in the world. To your mind, what system ought we introduce to try to improve better gender equity, gender parity within the Parliament? Answer. There is the option of proposing this at the candidate level, one female candidate, one male candidate, and then you would get this automatic equity. There are built-in barriers. For example, the way the whole system is set up, that can be difficult for women to participate because of certain factors related to lifestyle. As Mr. Mirand was saying, there are some things that can help, but we need a clear commitment to this. One way of doing that would be to have a system where you have a male candidate, female candidate, male candidate, female candidate. Thank you very much. Mr. Richards.
I'm just going to turn to this referendum question again briefly, because it seems as though that we've got a Liberal government that has a real aversion to the idea of asking the Canadian public what they think about the changes they want to make to our voting system. We saw it yesterday from the minister. She was clearly speaking with her personal opinion against the idea of a referendum. We're hearing it from members on the other side today, even kind of to the point of mischaracterizing, I think, things to some degree. So I wanted to just kind of quickly turn to it, because as I mentioned in my point of order, Mr. Chair, in the last federal referendum, 72%, almost 72% of Canadians voted in that referendum of the eligible voters. There was actually 13,725,966 eligible voters. Of that, 9,855,978 of them voted. Almost 10 million Canadians voted in that referendum. So I guess what I fail to understand is how the Liberal government would suggest that there would be a way they could reach more than that number of voters through any other kind of consultation method they might be talking about. Now, these ideas of the town halls, for example, if we were to take and have a town hall meeting in each of the ridings in the country, to get the same number of people participating, there would have to be 29,160 people show up at each and every one of those town hall meetings. Or, alternatively, if you were to look at maybe a more realistic number of what you might expect at a town hall, I think often you might find that maybe 75 people could show up to a town hall meeting. That would mean you'd have to have 131,413 town hall meetings to be able to reach the same number of people. So I would be more than happy to cede just a little bit of my time to any of the Liberal members on the other side if they could answer to me how they could potentially expect to consult with more Canadians than they would in a referendum. I'd be happy to cede my time to any of you if you'd like to answer that question.
Well, you understand that we're here to question the witness.
So obviously I'll take their silence as the fact that they don't have an answer to that.
No,
now,
I think the silence...
I'll also note that it's not just my questions they seem to want to ignore. And this idea of the Twitter questions that we've seen today, the Liberals have asked a few of them. I just checked a few minutes ago, and today there had been 29 distinct questions by distinct individuals. Of those 29 questions asked on there, 16 of them were asking about referendums, and I noticed the Liberals asked a few questions but chose to ignore the majority of the people who were asking about referendums and not ask that question. So I hope that they are going to understand eventually at some point that Canadians are not going to just take this sitting down. They're not going to just let the Liberals do whatever they want and change the voting system that all Canadians must have a buy-in to, and try to do it without giving Canadians a say in any way through a referendum on those changes. I certainly hope they are going to think the better of that and realize that Canadians will not accept that. They will not tolerate that. They will demand to have the right to be heard, to have their vote on any changes the Liberal Party is proposing. So with that, I'll conclude, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So there's no question for Mr. Kingsley here?
Do you want to divide your time with me? Yeah, sure. I would be happy to share the rest of my time with you.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Reid?
Thank you. This does raise a question, and the issue of participation, voter participation in a referendum. I am under the impression that if people find the question to be compelling, they're likely to turn out in a referendum. You had the experience of actually administering the referendum back in 1992, so I'll just, I'm not sure this is a fair question to you, you're trying to be impartial here, but I assume that your experience was that the high voter turnout was based on the fact that people felt the issue to be a compelling one. That's actually what drove them to the polls, whether they were for or against.
Well, I answered that I thought that the turnout was satisfactory for the results that were obtained. Were they optimal? I will tell you one thing. It depends on the portent of the question. I liked 93% in one referendum.
1995.
93% is what I liked when you're deciding something absolutely major. And we got that in this country. Why we don't aim for that, if referendums are the way to go, I don't know.
Right. In your experience, was there any distinction? We've heard that referenda are not inclusive. Certain groups don't come out to vote from the minister. In 1992, as compared to the election that you administered that came right after that, a year later, was there any difference in terms of which groups participated and did not participate?
Well, that's a big question. We have very limited time, but go ahead, give it a shot, please.
That is a matter that was not studied or looked at in detail, sir.
Thank you.
It was not studied. Okay. What I will mention, one thing, by the way, is that the political parties were not cooperating. The ones that favored the referendum question being yes, the parties were not, they were a team together, but they were not cooperating.
Thank you.
And that had an impact on the results.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Aldag, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Early on in your opening comments, you talked about a bit of advice to us was perhaps focusing on 3 or 4 models instead of going after 15. And so this is a request, you don't need to deal with it now, but I'd be really curious if you have, in your experience, come across what you would consider to be 3 or 4 top models that would be worth looking at. But not only that, witnesses who we could speak to, who would be able to speak to the attributes, the positive attributes as well as the negative on each one. And I just leave it with you that if you would have time or have something that you would be able to feed to the committee, it would be helpful as we move forward, given your wealth of experience.
Well, I read the, not totally, but significant pieces of the document that the minister tabled with you yesterday, the guide, and there is a good definition there, a very good definition of the various basic models, and not the variations upon the themes, but the basic models, and so I found that to be quite helpful. And in terms of other people to call, we have a whole slew of people in academia in this country that have a wealth of experience to share, much deeper knowledge about the advantages and disadvantages of different systems.
Sorry.
And
so
I'll be happy to share those names, but they're already well known to people.
Sure.
But I'll be happy.
It's just, yeah, if you have something or would be able to, it would be helpful to get it into the official evidence for us.
Okay.
A question I have that I posed this morning as well, and you've touched on this, but I'll give you another chance to go speak to it, And it's simply, as we move forward, what would you consider to be what I had termed earlier today to be a Canadian attribute for us to consider? I think you had called it a Canadian peculiarity. But what would be a key consideration that you would say we would need to look in the Canadian context as we move forward in revising our electoral systems?
Yeah. Well, I would consider the need to reconcile the remote and rural areas in any system that we devise, where the historic linkages with the elected representatives, in my view, have appeared to be different. And could lead us to a very interesting system. There was another major attribute to which I alluded a little bit earlier, but I would only be repeating what I've already said. So reconciling the geography of this country with the system of representation. The other thing that I would consider to be essential is to come up with a system that favors the national aspects of political parties, the coast to coast to coast aspect that I said, so that we can find members of caucus from all across the land and not have significant chunks missing or significant disproportion in representation in caucus.
Okay, fine, thanks. And got it. Okay, the final question I have is simply to offer you the floor. If you have any other final words of advice, thoughts that you haven't covered that you'd like to leave us with as sort of your parting thoughts for the day as we move forward with this.
Yeah. The only parting thought that I have is going to be to reiterate one thing. This committee must run the process with the Canadian public. You must beef up how you reach out to Canadians and how Canadians reach out to you. This is what the most significant piece of advice I can give you. It is not up to the government to do that. The government is entitled to do what it's want to do. You are the representatives of the people. You are the ones who must take this responsibility and give it life.
Thank you, Mr. Kingsley. Thank you for being with us today. You've provided us with a lively session in the doldrums of summer. We appreciate that you've stimulated debate while sharing your wealth of experience, and thank you, I believe on behalf of all members of the committee, thank you for your service to Canada and for the ideas that you brought to the committee today. So thank you very much, and you've made a great contribution to the discussion.
Le plaisir fut entièrement le mien. Merci.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you. Colleagues, we are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will have an in-camera session. I hope it will be a very brief in-camera session. We have a few decisions to make. We have to adopt decisions that were made by the steering committee. Thank you.